You know a little bit too much about COVID-19. You know more than you wanted to know. Carl, you too. But let's start with your story, Dr. Ayar. What happened?
Well, as you know, New York State, New York City is the epicenter for what's happening with this virus. It's continuing to spread to this day. Fortunately, we believe that here in New York, tri-state area, Connecticut, New Jersey, that we are at the peak and the flattening of this curve is taking place. And that's because of the actions that were taken in terms of social distancing. But in addition to that, we believe that the prayers of the righteous are availing much. We believe that the passion, and I believe God-given passion to our healthcare workers who are on the front line, who put themselves in harm's way, that passion is driving them to make a difference in how this is playing out in the lives of so many people. With me, and maybe we'll be able to get into the prophetic analysis of this. But my story is that, I have been interacting with elected officials, with community leaders, with people at all levels and walks of life before I got sick. So to try to trace back, where I got it, that's impossible. Some of the elected officials I was interacting with, they ended up testing positive and going into the hospital. So to trace it back, I don't know. I have pre-existing conditions. I've had asthma for 30 years. It's controlled. I try to lead a healthy lifestyle. But that pre-existing condition was there. So around this season, I began to experience, allergies and response to pollen, et cetera. So when I began to have symptoms the last week in March, I attributed it to, what I normally may experience very mildly annually. But over a 3-day period, I began to have chills, consistent high fever. My body was experiencing tremors, fatigue, all of the body aches and pains, especially abdominal cramps that you would experience beyond a regular flu. And by Saturday morning, the 28th of March, I began to become short of breath. And I knew from all of the doctors that I've spoken to, I've been working with the governor and the mayor in terms of responses to what's happening on the ground, that was problematic. So I called my son, PJ, and, Jamal, and I said, hey, I got to go to the hospital. And I was trying my best not to go to the hospital because you can go there and get sick, unfortunately. So he came, picked me up. It was like 7 o'clock in the morning. We got there in 15 minutes. It is a hospital that I have a relationship with and was comfortable because they had my records. And when we got there, man, it was a ghost town.
Wow.
There was just a system of tents. And when we pulled up, one security guard came out and he immediately told Jamal, you can't go with him. He has to go by himself. And he began to lead me through the tent into the ER. And when I got to the ER, they had my records, took me in, sat me on a bed. And it's not like this is open space and interacting with people. Every little cubicle and bed is closed off with curtains. And the interesting thing is the distance between you and the person next to you is only 3 feet. And the only thing that separates you is a curtain. So I'm sitting there. And they immediately gave me oxygen. Thank God I didn't have to go to ICU or CCU. They began giving me oxygen because my oxygen levels were down to 85, which is, too low. And I began to feel better, but the other symptoms were getting worse. And sitting there, although you're surrounded by people, they are covered in protective gear, right down to not only face masks, but plastic shields coming down over their faces and their bodies covered. and everybody's trying to be careful and keep distance. And I'm sitting there, and the part of the curtain is open so I could see out where, things were happening. And I'm watching as people are being rolled in, sitting up in a bed, taken into a room or a cubicle next to me or across from me. And within a half an hour, these same people are being rolled out, but they're not sitting up. They're laying down and a sheet's covering their face. And this is a Catholic hospital. So, the nurses are walking out doing the sign of the cross, which basically, because you can't have a chaplain or a priest there because it's restricted, they're essentially giving in their way last rites to these individuals. I'm sitting there for 8 hours. They are giving me x-rays, EKG, taking blood, doing all of that. And within 2 hours, they came to the decision that I needed to stay to bring my blood oxygen levels up. But I didn't get a room until 8 hours later. So for 8 hours, I'm watching death surrounding me. The symptoms that I'm going through are increasing in intensity. And in fact, this last week is the first time that I heard the news speak of the fact that the virus can affect your brain.
Wow.
It affects your lungs. It can affect your heart. All right. Definitely, more specifically, your respiratory system, but it also affects your brain. So while I'm sitting there, I'm losing the sense of taste. I'm losing the sense of smell. The tip of my tongue becomes numb, where I can't feel anything. So I'm monitoring all of this. And finally, at the end of the day, after witnessing several people carried out who passed, I'm taken to a room. And, it's not a room with a view. It's a room that the doors kept closed at all times. And, the curtains are drawn around my bed. And God bless these healthcare workers, for their passion for what they do. And you're surrounded by people who are engaged in trying to help save your life. But at the same time, you're not alone, but you're lonely.
Wow.
Because you feel isolated. You feel the anxiety. And they were trying to figure out how they were going to treat me. So fortunately, again, blessed to have, 4 specialists, 2 pulmonary specialists, 1 infectious disease doctor and a medical doctor who came in. And they decided to treat me with what President Trump talked about, but of course there was pushback because most of the evidence is anecdotal with regard to its success in fighting this particular virus. And there's no treatment, there's no vaccine. So my pulmonary specialist and infectious disease specialist decided that they were going to treat me with hydroxychloroquine. So they did. They added azithromycin, which is an antibiotic, and the hydroxychloroquine is used to treat malaria. It's a very strong drug, and the possibility is that it can damage your heart. So I'm in there with pre-existing conditions and aware that essentially I've got a 50-50 chance here. I've got a 50-50 proposition, with coming out on the other side of this. So they also began to give me injections of anticoagulants because they discovered that the way people were dying within 3 hours of coming into the hospital is because not only does the virus attack the lungs and create a breakdown in the bronchial passages, which allows it to fill with fluid, all right, so you can't exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it also, the virus creates blood clots. So blood clots were being formed and people were dying from clotting. So they, along with the drugs, gave me anticoagulants and, began that treatment. But that first night is when the lack of taste and smell became more intense. And then I began to experience hallucinations. you're already filled with anxiety because of the isolation, but now you're experiencing a drifting between what's real and what's not real. And I was a little apprehensive about going to sleep, because every time I did go to sleep, I would start having these nightmares, and all I would see was darkness. I could say this, I'm sure our faith audience would understand, but it came to a point where I saw myself walking around the room and down the hall while I'm still in the bed. That was freaking me out. I'm saying, hey, what's wrong with this? And, I got to the place where it became so intense, this feeling of darkness, like I was staring into the abyss. And it was at that point that I made the decision to simply abandon myself to God's providence. I said, Lord, you're in control of history, my life, everything that's happening. I'm good. So I'm just going to find rest in your divine providence. The wrestling continued for several days, but I will tell you, once they started that regimen, within 36 hours, I began to experience a marked difference in my health and in my body. But mentally, emotionally, I'm puzzled by, and the overriding theme was darkness.
Wow.
And that's what, influenced the experience the most while I was in that space. And I was by myself, man. No matter how many people were around me, I was alone. So, I began to come back. Things began to settle down. I could sleep a little. I couldn't eat because you don't have an appetite. You don't even want to drink, and you've got to drink so you can hydrate, stay hydrated, because that's another problem if you're dehydrated. I didn't want to. I had to force myself to. And finally, within 48 hours, there was light at the end of the tunnel. But I had no idea what I had just walked through emotionally, psychologically, mentally.
Wow.
And, by the fifth day, they brought in another healthcare worker who was on the front line who tested positive. They put him right next to me, in the bed next to me. We're 3 feet apart with only that curtain between us. He's hacking and he's going through all these symptoms and he's moaning and groaning. So I called my doctor. I said, Doc, it's time for me to go. So he said, well, your oxygen levels are good, but we're concerned. I said, look, I will buy an oxygenation concentrator, which is an oxygen machine that creates oxygen, because you're not allowed to store oxygen tanks in your home. I said, I'll get that. And sure enough, man, I got on the phone and I called a medical supply place. And I said, look, I need a bed. I need to rent, a hospital bed to rent. I need a table. I need oxygenation machine, all of that delivered to my house tomorrow. And they got it there. And I will tell you, in the midst of making that phone call and hanging up, I broke down, because I started thinking, I thank God that I was in a position to simply make a phone call and have the means to do that. But I thought about all the people who are not in that position, who don't have oh man. I'm still walking out of this, who don't have the means, who have to go to work, who have to push themselves and sacrifice themselves, put themselves in harm's way, just for the survival of their own families. So it was bittersweet that I could do that, and yet at the same time feel for those who couldn't. So 5 days later, I leave the hospital, I go home, I'm in quarantine for 14 days.
Wow.